We are in Salt Lake City for Permissionless, and today I'm with Greg, founder of Akash.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I would love to start with how you got the idea of Akash to begin with.
So the idea really came not in a single moment. It was a combination of several events, personal life across like broader industry, right? My background, I'm an open source developer. I've been contributing primarily for cloud native infrastructure. So I helped in the early days of Kubernetes, Docker, um, Terraform, and I grew up with open source, and I value open source as the way we humans evolve, right, in terms of software. So any sufficiently successful software has to be open source, be it Linux, be it Android, be it anything that you would deem that will have impact on a globe, internet has to be open source. Um, but we saw a direction with a cloud that was opposite. It was getting increasingly close,
Yeah.
and increasingly oligopolized by few players. And that was a future we didn't want to accept. So it was a lot of us in the industry as well as academia were working on various solutions over years to decouple control from resources, right? And so it's years of work, years of research that led us to a point where we can have a truly open source cloud. And what that means is, well, the code base being open source, but also the network, the actual functioning should be open as well. So we began with an open source code base, and we figured out that there is this notion of blockchain or decentralization. This is 2015, 2016, so very, very early,
Wow. Yeah.
that we can leverage to actually build a network, right? So after several experiments on Ethereum in 2016, we were convinced that this is possible. So we wrote a paper and published that in 2017 called a decentralized supercloud. And we proposed that, hey, there is enormous amounts of underutilized capacity around the world, right? On average, um, about 75% of data center capacity that's um, active is underutilized, right? Or that's a conservative estimate, and the reality is somewhere like 90%. And if we can leverage this underutilized compute and create a true cloud that's usable, we can achieve an open source cloud. So that was a notion we began with, and several years later we shipped, and now Akash is a leading decentralized cloud provider.
I mean, in hindsight, it looks like incredibly ambitious, but obviously like a good direction to take. I think when you said you grew up with open source, what do you mean by this?
So I grew up in rural India, and without a computer, right? And this is in the 90s. 90s software is closed source. Windows was the primary way. In order to use Windows, you need a license, you need to purchase. And that was in American dollars, which was very expensive. So my only alternative was Linux and open source technologies.
Yeah.
So I think that was, in hindsight, one of the most powerful things happened in my life, because if I started off on Windows and grew up in Windows, I probably will have a different viewpoint on how the software should be constructed. But growing up in open source, it was not very obvious then that open source is going to dominate the world, but it was very obvious to me that only way for me to get access to computers is through, well, piracy was always an option,
Yeah.
but also open source was a better option because you get full real software without having to pirate. So, and now you look at internet, right? So 97% of web servers that run the internet runs on Linux, open source, not on Windows, right? So now you see open source as a dominant factor in software. Uh, so that's what I meant by grew up in open source, and you know, without open source, I wouldn't be where I am.
As you begin to work towards this idea, what were some of the initial challenges? I imagine, like, obviously, like, technology has evolved since. What were some of the biggest challenges then?
So getting something working in a decentralized setting is extremely hard, right? Especially general purpose cloud computing, right? And no one, I mean, now you have quite a lot of decentralized compute projects, but Akash was the only one back
Yeah.
then, the first one. So being a pioneer and doing it in an open manner, I think takes conviction. Um, Conviction because we open source before product market fit. We open source, our first line of code was open source, right? We
Yeah.
didn't close source. We were not worried about theft, which is a thing now in crypto. We didn't, worry too much about, I suppose, you know, like being transparent because we're going to make mistakes being open source. We
Right.
didn't really care much about because our values were very strong. We absolutely believed open source is the way to go, and we still do. So starting off with a high value framework and withstanding a lot of the attacks is very challenging, right? So when we launched Akash Network, um, in a fully open source manner, that also brought us a lot of advantages. So it got us quite a lot of love from community because
Mm-hmm.
we community has never experienced an open source cloud before. So that worked out to our advantage, but I think challenges would be just getting a decentralized control plane
Yeah.
where you have no control over the servers, right? And we didn't do it in a fashion that's done today where projects launch with full control. They control all the validators, they control all the servers, they control pretty much all the source code. It's fully closed source. Yeah, it's easier to launch when you have full control, but it's extremely hard to launch when you have no control.
Mm-hmm.
Because, when you launch, you're going to have, errors. You're going to have bugs. And
Yeah.
you can't fix them and push them, when you want. If you want to upgrade the network, you need to have a proposal. If you need that is rooted in consensus, you need to get validators to vote on these proposals. So it becomes very challenging when you have no control and you have to ship product that doesn't have product market fit yet,
Yeah.
right? Um, and now, a lot of the projects are now leveraging Akash's source code to launch, right? So some of the code we wrote is used by NVIDIA, is used by Microsoft, it's used by Department of Defense, it's used by so many people, and a lot of crypto projects obviously use Akash's source code, right? But if we didn't do the things that were needed for Akash to be successful, we wouldn't have the entire decentralized
Yeah.
compute or devins or what we call it today.
So sort of like failing in public, which is, I imagine it's not easy. I think I'm a true believer in like the collaborative aspect of it, and I think that's the best way forward. Like as humans, for us to evolve, we need to collaborate with each other. So I truly love that aspect of it. I can imagine the challenge of coordinating people and how that might present blockers to move forward at the pace, at an ideal pace. Did you experience that, and how did you went about it?
Coordination is extremely hard, especially with open source software, and especially when you have to get votes from validators to upgrade your software. Just relentless pursuit, I suppose, right? I had to send people to people's houses in Europe to wake them up in the middle of the night
Oh,
to
wow.
do and to get them to vote.
Oh.
So, just simple examples on what coordination you need.
Mhm.
Um, I had to work with people I don't know their names, right? Just handles. Um, you have to, you know, every spending proposal, you need to get majority that you need to rally votes. So unlike a company where as a CEO you have full control, there is no CEO in Akash Network. I'm a core contributor, right? There is no boss, right? So there's no one telling other people what to do. It is a consensus. We all agree that this is the right thing to do. Um, so it's very, very challenging to get humans agreeing on a single direction. Doesn't matter how aligned you are. I mean, including your family, right? Imagine having my kid and my wife agreeing on a single thing. Well, kid is too young, but to have an opinion. But it's very hard to have humans agree on things. And to the point about evolution of humanity, right? So we humans physically um, stopped physically evolving about 10,000 years ago. Like our brains did not get bigger, but we got extremely smart in this 10,000 years. And the reason for that is we can coordinate and we can share knowledge and we can mix. So, through diversity. So because of our shareability and our ability to teach the offspring and so on and so forth is how we evolve. And the most important thing for the evolution is open access to information. So the more open and more frictionless there is a way to access information, the faster we can evolve. And I'm a true believer in that. And that's why I think open source is not just beneficial to one single entity like Akash, but beneficial to the whole ecosystem. And it's one of the reasons why DVIN today, like decentralized compute ecosystem exists is because of Akash, right? Without that,
Yeah.
um, you know, people were frowning on us in 2017 when we said we're going to decentralize cloud because back then it was all about smart contracts, right? So every cycle, crypto has a different narrative. 2017 was all about smart contracts. If you're not doing smart contracts, you're frowned upon. So, but we took that, that didn't bother us to continue down our journey.
Yeah.
And now decentralized compute is a thing. Like you get a lot of funding. We raised like $1.8 million in funding to launch the chain, right? So because no one would fund us. So there's a lot of challenges. We go back and we had to dig through this things, but we overcame those and we're here.
It's also coordination, like people agreeing what's valuable at different times, if you think about it. But it's interesting how it plays and how it impacts development because you started like years ago, but only just recently they started paying attention to it to the degree of wanting to really fund it and take it to the next level. You split the open source into two. And could you explain for anyone watching open source network?
So there are two aspects of any network or any product, right? There's the source, any digital product. There's the source code, and there's the aspect of running the source code. So from a source code standpoint, is it open or is it closed? Matters a lot. Open source means, anyone can look at the source code and verify that this source code does what it said it's supposed to do. There is no malice. There is no privacy encroachment. There is no one extracting value that you're not aware of. It is full truth, open source, right?
Yeah.
And then you can take an open source product and still run in a closed source setting. Say, for example, Llama, which is open source model, you can still take the open source model and run that as a centralized model, right? A closed source model, a closed setting with gated access. And that's the second part. What can you do with open source in terms of making it available for people to use? Is it permissionless? Is it self-custodial? Is there a user login? Because if there's a user login, that means there's an entry in a database someone controls. What happens if the company that goes down, that controls the database, goes down? What happens if there's a human being that just runs a delete on that user? Simple error. It happens a lot. What happened with CrowdStrike, right? CrowdStrike, somebody push bad code. Happens a lot. So with closed source, again, the big challenge is, well, you're a company that DeepIn, quote unquote, launched a network, but your source code is closed. Okay, what happens if your company shuts down? Oh, it won't shut down. No, companies shut down all the time. What happens if you don't get funding? What happens if you sell your company to someone else? That someone else is going to take over your source code. Like what's happening with 23andMe right now. 23andMe is the DNA database, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you gave your DNA to 23andMe, they're in trouble. Their stock is failing and they're up for sale. Somebody's going to buy them. And whoever buys them has access to all your DNA data.
Yeah.
That's an example of a closed source, closed system, right? So that's why you want open source as a foundation for decentralization. And I will reject any notion that a closed source system is decentralized. It's not a reality. And it's really sad what's happening with DeepIn today, that there are a lot of these networks that are just popping out of nowhere with fully closed source data, code bases, and the justification is decentralization is a spectrum. Yes, decentralization is a spectrum, but the spectrum begins with the open source code base and ends with energy sourcing.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people in the industry would heavily align with you, and like it's really powerful and honestly inspiring that you stuck to your principles from the beginning, and despite the challenges, like you remained aligned to it. Is there anything exciting coming out for Akash?
Yes. Yeah. Well, so we have a new product launch that will be coming out by end of the year. We've been secretly testing this product. That's generating quite a lot of adoption for Akash. The challenge today is for LLM developers to get to deploy an LLM and use the LLM that is large, like a Llama 3.1405B, takes about 6 hours. It's
Okay.
extremely expensive. It costs to run a production grade LLM, it costs about $30 per hour, which is, which adds up quite a lot. And that's about, if you're running 10 hours, about $300, and that's, quite a lot of money, right? So it's limiting user adoption quite a lot because it's expensive. It takes a long time to run. It's very hard to maintain too. So we have a new product that's going to significantly reduce the cost and the time it takes to run LLM. So that way, we'll be able to attract your traditional Web 2 developers, and Akash will be one of the most attractive products, not only in Web 3 but also Web 2, right?
That's amazing.
So leading up to that launch, we have several other small launches that are leading up, and one big thing that's coming up in the next week is credit card payments with self-custodial credit card payments. That's very important because a lot of times when you put a credit card, you have to log in, right? And we don't want a login because we don't want to deal with user data.
Yeah.
That's a decision we made because, like I said, the moment we start storing user data, Overclock Labs becomes a liability at that point. The whole point of building open source decentralized systems is to remove ourselves as a liability. Anything could happen to Overclock Labs, and Akash will run as designed. That's the future we want. So we are very reluctant to collect user information. So we have to design a system that takes a lot of care on how you handle credit card payments. Right? It's really hard to manage that. So we have a new system in place that's coming up in next week. So that removes a big barrier for adoption. And frankly, Akash, the barrier seems to be, people to pay with credit cards, right? So, and we have series of small launches leading up to the big launch, which is going to be end of the year, and it's really exciting.
That's truly exciting. Yeah, it's almost there.
Yeah, it's almost there.
For everyone watching, where can they find you?
Twitter is the best place. Greg Osuri is my handle. I'm very active on Twitter. On Telegram as well, Greg Osuri is the same handle. Reach out to me. I'm more responsive on Twitter than any other network. And for AkashNet, Akash.network is the best place. I mean, you have a lot of socials from there on.
Greg, thank you.
Hey, what's up?
But it's not something Genzio is afraid of.
If you want to survive, you got to build a hive.
You know we do not understand that we do not want.
Ladies and gentlemen.
We're back at the Genzio Media House.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today.